You know, sometimes you think you've seen everything when it comes to homeowner associations. Ridiculous fines, bizarre rules about mailbox colors, even neighbors peeking over fences to report you for leaving a trash can out too long. But what happened to my grandpa went way beyond any of that. See, my grandpa has lived in his neighborhood for almost 40 years. Long before the HOA even existed, he was one of the first people to build his home there. He poured the foundation with his own hands, planted the oak tree that still shades his porch, and built the garage workshop where he spends most of his days. To him, that house isn't just a property, it's a lifetime of memories. But then, about 10 years ago, the HOA was formed. At first, they were just annoying, letters about repainting the fence, complaints about how high the grass could grow, and threats about community violations. Grandpa usually ignored them. His old school, the kind of man who fought for his country, raised his family, and never asked anyone for permission to live his life. But recently, things took a much darker turn. The HOA board had hired what they called their community enforcement officers. Now, don't get the wrong idea, these weren't real cops. They weren't trained law enforcement, didn't carry badges issued by the city, and definitely didn't have any legal authority. They were just a couple of guys with cheap uniforms, shiny toy-looking badges, and a big ego boost from the HOA board. Grandpa called them wannabe cowboys with clipboards. These so-called officers started going around the neighborhood, acting like they had police power. They'd knock on doors, threaten fines, and even tell people they could press charges if rules weren't followed. Most neighbors were too intimidated to fight back, but Grandpa wasn't having it. One particular afternoon, Grandpa was in his garage, working on a project. He had a few old tools spread out on his workbench, the radio was playing some classic country, and the smell of sawdust filled the air. That's when he heard the heavy knock at the door. Not the polite kind of knock, either, the kind that demanded attention. When Grandpa opened the door, there they were, two of the HOA's cops. Both were wearing dark uniforms with patches that read, Community Enforcement, and they carried radios on their belts to make themselves look official. One of them said, "Sir, we've received reports that you're violating HOA policy by storing dangerous equipment in plain sight. You're going to need to let us in so we can conduct an inspection." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. "Inspection? This is my property. You don't have any right to come inside." But the taller one smirked. "Sir, refusal to comply could result in HOA sanctions, fines, and further action. If necessary, we're authorized to use force." That's when Grandpa realized, these guys weren't just trying to fine him. They were trying to act like real police, threatening him on his own doorstep. Now, here's where things get interesting. See, Grandpa is a military veteran. He served back when discipline, respect, and protecting what's yours meant something. And one thing he's never done, is let a bully walk over him. Inside that house, locked away in a safe for decades, was a piece of history, his old 1948 Colt. It was a family heirloom, something he kept clean and oiled all these years, not because he ever planned to use it, but because it reminded him of where he came from and what he stood for. And these two wannabe cops? They had no idea what kind of man they were dealing with. Grandpa gave them one last warning. "You boys need to leave. Right now. This is private property." But instead of leaving, one of them stepped forward, his hand resting on what looked like a baton clipped to his belt. His voice turned sharp. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Step aside." That was the moment everything shifted. Grandpa realized these men weren't just bluffing anymore. They were about to cross a line. And that's when he decided, it was time to remind them that some people don't scare so easily. Grandpa stood in the doorway, his jaw set like stone. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, you knew he meant every syllable. The two so-called HOA cops clearly thought they were dealing with just another frightened homeowner who'd fold under pressure. They couldn't have been more wrong. The taller one, who seemed to be the ringleader, shifted his stance and shoved a clipboard against his chest. "Last chance, old man. Either you let us in, or we'll have to escalate this." Grandpa's eyes narrowed. "Escalate? Son, I've been through real escalations, ones where lives were on the line. You think a clipboard and a cheap badge scare me?" The shorter one glanced nervously at his partner, but the taller man sneered. He pushed forward, trying to shoulder his way into the house. That was the mistake. Grandpa didn't waste time arguing anymore. He stepped back into his living room, calm and steady, and walked toward the wooden cabinet in the corner. Inside was the old safe that had been sitting there for decades. With hands that didn't shake even after all these years, he spun the combination lock, opened the door, and pulled out a piece of history, his Colt 1911, manufactured back in 1948. It wasn't flashy. The steel had that aged patina, the kind of finish you can't fake. It had been cleaned countless times, stored properly, and respected like the relic it was. And yes, it was still loaded. Grandpa always said a firearm without a bullet is just a paperweight. When he turned back around, the two officers froze. The confidence drained from their faces like water leaking from a bucket. Grandpa didn't point it at them, he didn't have to. He held it low, angled toward the floor, but the weight of its presence was enough to shift the entire mood. "Boys," he said in that low, gravelly voice, "you've got about 5 seconds to get off my porch before I stop treating you like clowns and start treating you like intruders." The taller one tried to regain his composure. His voice cracked slightly as he said, You can't threaten us with a weapon. That's a felony." Grandpa's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "No, son. What's a felony is impersonating law enforcement, trespassing on private property, and threatening a veteran in his own home. You don't have any jurisdiction here. You're just two boys playing dress-up." The shorter man tugged at his partner's sleeve. "Come on, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But the taller one's pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. He tried to puff his chest out again, but his eyes kept flicking nervously to the Colt in Grandpa's hand. "You think this scares us? You pull that trigger, you'll regret it." Grandpa took a single step forward, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The sound alone made both men flinch. "Son, if I wanted to pull the trigger, you wouldn't still be talking. I don't bluff. Now get off my property." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The radio in the garage was still faintly playing an old Johnny Cash song, the only sound cutting through the silence. Finally, the shorter one snapped. He shoved his partner toward the door. "Forget it, man. Let's go. This guy's crazy." The taller one muttered something under his breath, but followed, backing off the porch with his face burning red from humiliation. Grandpa didn't chase them. He didn't wave the Colt around or shout threats. He simply stood tall, the pistol steady in his hand, and watched them retreat down the driveway. When they were finally gone, Grandpa walked back inside, set the Colt on the table, and sat down in his old rocking chair. He let out a long breath, not because he was shaken, but because he knew this wasn't over. The HOA had crossed a line today, and they weren't the type to let embarrassment slide. The only question now was, what would they try next? Grandpa figured the incident was over once those two imposters scurried off his porch, but he knew enough about people to recognize pride when he saw it. And pride, especially bruised pride, was dangerous. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the HOA board to make their next move. The very next morning, Grandpa was out in his yard watering the grass when a convoy of SUVs pulled up near his driveway. Out stepped 3 members of the HOA board, looking smug as ever in their pressed polo shirts, with the association's logo stitched on the chest. And right behind them, like backup dancers, were those same 2 wannabe cops, their faces still sour from yesterday's humiliation. One of the board members, a stocky man named Richard who loved throwing his weight around, shouted from the sidewalk. "Mr. Johnson, we need to have a word about the incident yesterday. You assaulted and threatened our officers with a firearm." Grandpa turned off the hose, resting it on the grass, and gave them a look that could cut through steel. "Assault? Threat? All I did was stand my ground. Those boys barged onto my property, pretended to be cops, and tried to force their way into my home. If anyone here should be facing charges, it's them." Richard crossed his arms, smirking like he thought he had the upper hand. "Those men are officially sanctioned by the HOA. They have every right to conduct compliance inspections." Grandpa chuckled, shaking his head. "Sanctioned by the HOA doesn't mean a damn thing. You don't have the authority of the city, the county, or the state. You're just neighbors with clipboards, nothing more. And until the day this property stops being mine, you'll have no say about what goes on behind my door." That made Richard's smirk falter, but only for a moment. He snapped his fingers, and the 2 officers stepped forward again, trying to look tough. The taller one, still smarting from yesterday, pointed at Grandpa. "This guy's dangerous. We should call the sheriff and report that he pulled a weapon on us." The shorter one hesitated, glancing at the board members. "But, if we do that, won't the sheriff find out we were acting like cops? That could backfire." Grandpa, who had perfect hearing despite his age, raised an eyebrow. "Backfire? That's the smartest thing I've heard you say. Because impersonating law enforcement is a crime. You boys want to dig that hole deeper? Be my guest." The HOA board exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to being challenged, let alone outmaneuvered by someone they thought was just a cranky old man. But Richard wasn't about to let this go. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered. "Well, we're not letting this slide. You brandished a firearm on HOA property, and that's grounds for immediate action. We're filing for a lien on your home." Grandpa's eyes flashed with fire. He stepped closer to the edge of his lawn, his voice like rolling thunder. "HOA property. Listen here, this house, this yard, this land, it's mine. I built it with my own hands before any of you parasites showed up with your rules and your fees. And as for liens, you try to take this house from me, you'll find out real quick why nobody ever won a fight, by pushing a Johnson too far." The words hung in the air like a warning shot. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of a lawnmower down the street. Richard tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked just a little. "You'll regret this. We'll see what the sheriff has to say when we explain everything." Grandpa just smirked. "Good idea. Call the sheriff. Tell him your fake cops trespassed on private property and threatened a veteran. Let's see how far you get before he slaps the cuffs on you." The shorter officer paled. "Maybe we should, drop this. The old guy's not bluffing." But Richard wasn't listening. He barked orders, and within minutes, one of the board members was already on the phone. Grandpa didn't flinch. He knew the sheriff in town personally, had known him since he was just a rookie deputy. If these fools thought the law was going to save them, they were in for a rude awakening. Still, Grandpa also knew this was the beginning of something bigger. The HOA had gone from letters and fines to impersonating cops, and now they were dragging in the actual authorities. That kind of desperation only meant one thing: they were scared of him. And scared people do stupid things. Grandpa turned back toward his porch, the morning sun glinting off the window. He didn't look rattled. If anything, he looked like a man ready for whatever storm was about to roll his way. Because if there was one thing Grandpa understood better than anyone, it was this: once you draw a line in the sand, you never step back. It didn't take long for the sheriff's cruiser to pull into the neighborhood. The sight of the flashing lights had curious neighbors peeking out their windows, some even gathering in their driveways. After all, in a quiet suburban street, this was the biggest drama they'd seen in years. Grandpa sat calmly on his porch, sipping his coffee like nothing unusual was happening. He didn't scramble, didn't fidget, and certainly didn't look guilty. Meanwhile, the HOA board huddled together like vultures, rehearsing their story one last time. The two wannabe cops straightened their uniforms, hoping the sheriff would buy their act. When Sheriff Daniels stepped out of his car, the tension shifted immediately. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for nonsense. And he wasn't just any lawman, he'd known Grandpa Johnson since he was a rookie. The old man had taught him how to hunt when he was younger, and had even helped him fix up his first car. Respect ran deep between them. Richard, the HOA president, strutted forward like he owned the place. "Sheriff, thank you for coming. We have a serious situation here." This man, he jabbed a finger toward Grandpa, pulled a loaded gun on our community officers yesterday. "He's a danger to everyone around here." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Community officers? You mean police deputies?" The taller fake cop puffed his chest. "We're sanctioned by the HOA, sir. We enforce compliance and community safety." The sheriff turned slowly, eyeing their uniforms. He leaned closer, squinting at the shiny badge pinned to the taller one's chest. Then he let out a sharp laugh. This isn't a badge. This is a toy store knockoff. And unless the HOA somehow outranks the state of Texas, you boys aren't officers of anything." The shorter one swallowed hard, his face turning pale. We were just doing what we were told." Sheriff Daniels turned to Grandpa. "Mr. Johnson, why don't you tell me your side?" Grandpa leaned back in his rocking chair, his voice calm but firm. "They came onto my property yesterday without permission, demanded to search my home, and when I told them to leave, they threatened to use force. I reminded them where the line was drawn. They didn't like it. End of story." Daniels nodded slowly. He already knew the truth. The look in Grandpa's eyes told him everything he needed. Then he spun back to Richard, his tone sharp as a whip. "So let me get this straight. You sent two untrained, unlicensed men to impersonate law enforcement and force their way into a private citizen's home." Richard's smug expression faltered. "They weren't impersonating. They're community security. Community security doesn't carry fake badges, doesn't threaten residents, and doesn't trespass," Daniels snapped. "What you've done here is illegal. Impersonating an officer carries real consequences. You better hope Mr. Johnson doesn't press charges." The crowd of neighbors watching from their lawns started whispering. Some even chuckled under their breath. The HOA's mighty reputation was crumbling in front of everyone. Grandpa finally stood up, the old wood of the porch creaking under his boots. He didn't need to raise his voice, his words carried all the weight they needed. "I don't need to press charges, Sheriff. These boys just learned a lesson they won't forget. But let me make one thing clear: this is my land. My home. And if anyone tries to threaten me here again, I'll defend it the same way I always have. No clipboard, no fake badge, and no board meeting is ever going to change that. The sheriff tipped his hat. That's fair enough, Mr. Johnson. I'll make sure these officers don't play dress-up again. As for you, Richard, he turned, glaring at the HOA president, you'd better dial it back. If I hear another complaint about your board stepping outside its authority, I'll be the one knocking at your door. And believe me, it won't be as friendly. Richard sputtered, his face red as a beet. But he couldn't argue. Not now. Not with the sheriff standing against him, and the neighbors silently cheering Grandpa on. One by one, the HOA crew packed themselves back into their SUVs and left, humiliated and defeated. The fake cops didn't even look back, they knew better. As the sheriff drove off, the neighborhood buzz slowly faded. Grandpa sat back down in his chair, took another sip of his coffee, and let a satisfied smile tug at the corner of his lips. The Colt rested safely back inside, locked away once again. He hadn't needed to fire it, hadn't needed to raise it higher than his waist. Just the reminder that some people still had a backbone had been enough. Grandpa knew the HOA might still try something down the road, people like that never quit completely. But they'd think twice before stepping foot on his porch again. Because one thing was certain, you don't push a man who's lived through wars, raised a family, and carried the same Colt by his side for nearly a lifetime. And that day, the HOA learned the hard way, my grandpa wasn't a man to be messed with.